Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into something immense, something that didn't just shape maps, but forged the very pathways of governance, trade, and culture across continents for, well, over 1,000 years.
It really is a fascinating period.
We're talking about the era of colossal empires, specifically focusing on a period stretching roughly from 100 BCE right through to 1300 CE.
Yeah.
This wasn't just a time of big kingdoms, it was a time when vast, interconnected powers fundamentally altered human history.
It truly is a foundational period. While empires had existed for millennia, the scale, administrative complexity, and sheer reach achieved by powers during this specific time frame. I mean, they set new benchmarks and created legacies that are still relevant today.
Right.
It's fascinating how this deep dive into your sources reveals a world becoming increasingly connected, often through conquest and control, sure, but also through, vibrant exchange.
Exactly. And this deep dive is built around your sources, particularly those focused on an empire across 3 continents. As you might guess, the primary lens is the Roman Empire, perhaps the most famous example of that multi-continental reach.
Mhm.
But the sources are careful to also give us vital glimpses of other significant empires and the often overlooked yet crucial role played by various nomadic groups operating during the same stretch of history.
And our mission today, as always with a deep dive, isn't to wade through a dry academic textbook. It's about giving you that essential shortcut.
Yeah, getting to the core of it.
Exactly. We're going to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, those surprising facts, the key insights that tell us what made this particular empire, the Roman one, tick, how it achieved its incredible reach, its complex internal workings, the immense challenges it faced, and ultimately how it transformed, because the story isn't just one of rise and fall, but of profound change that laid the groundwork for new eras. We'll get you the core story and the surprising details without getting lost in exhaustive detail.
Sounds great. So, to really understand Rome's rise, we have to set the historical stage. The sources emphasize that Rome didn't appear in a vacuum. The world around the Mediterranean and stretching into Asia had a long, rich history of sophisticated state building and empire formation long before Rome dominated the scene. What do your sources highlight about these earlier and coexisting powers?
Well, the sources really underscore the deep roots of empire in this region. They point back millennia to Mesopotamia, highlighting a long tradition of powerful states controlling territory and resources.
Okay, so we're talking ancient history here.
Way back. Then they specifically mentioned the Assyrian Empire, which by the first millennium BCE had demonstrated a remarkable capacity for controlling vast regions through military power and pretty sophisticated administration. They really set a precedent for large territorial states.
Right, and the sources also bring in the Greek city-states, like Athens and Sparta, situated primarily in the eastern Mediterranean. These weren't empires in the same territorial sense, maybe?
Not exactly, no. But the sources note them as important centers of civic life, political experimentation, and intellectual thought that had a huge cultural impact,
Yeah.
Their ideas spread far and wide.
Okay.
Absolutely. But then a massive disruptive force emerges in the late 4th century BCE with Alexander of Macedon. The sources describe his sweeping conquests across parts of North Africa, West Asia, and into Iran. It's an incredible expansion of power in a very short time.
Almost unbelievable speed.
It really was.
Yeah.
Though the sources add that fascinating detail that his own soldiers eventually refused to march further east, which sort of limited his reach into the heart of Asia.
Which really shows the limits even of such a dynamic military leader, doesn't it?
It does. Even Alexander had his boundaries.
And his conquests led to what's called the Hellenistic period, right? The sources mention the widespread of Greek culture, language, and ideas across this vast area, sometimes thousands of miles from mainland Greece.
They do. And that spread was undeniable. Greek became a language of administration and elite culture in many areas. Cities were founded, Greek philosophy spread.
Uh-huh.
However, the sources make a crucial and often overlooked point here. While Hellenistic culture was influential, it didn't simply steamroll everything else.
Okay.
They emphasized the enduring significance of other cultures, especially Iranian culture, in shaping this vast region. The sources suggest Iranian influence, ideas, and administrative traditions were often just as, if not more, important than Hellenistic ones in many areas, particularly east of the Mediterranean coast. This depth of non-Greek influence is really key context.
That's a really important nuance. And that point about Iranian culture is particularly important because the sources remind us that even before Alexander, As early as the 6th century BCE, Iranians had already established control over massive parts of the old Assyrian Empire.
That's right, the Achaemenids.
They built extensive networks of trade that reached all the way across the Mediterranean.
Precisely. So when Rome starts to emerge as a major player, the sources present the Iranians, specifically the Achaemenid dynasty initially, and then later their powerful successors, the Sasanians, as formidable, long-established rivals.
They weren't just some minor kingdom on the border.
Not at all. They controlled vast territories stretching into Central Asia and held sway over crucial trade routes that connected east and west, routes Rome would desperately want access to. It puts Rome's expansion to a much more complex geopolitical context. These weren't empty lands Rome was expanding into.
So Rome rises against this backdrop. A world with deep traditions of empire, influential cultural centers like the Greek city-states, the widespread but uneven legacy of Alexander's conquests, and established powerful rivals like the Iranians controlling key resources and routes.
Exactly. And the sources describe Rome itself emerging from central Italy, initially just one power among many on the peninsula. It wasn't inevitable that Rome would become the dominant force.
Right, it wasn't preordained.
Not at all. Its rise, particularly its expansion across the Mediterranean starting from the 2nd century BCE, really capitalized on the political disruption and power vacuums that followed the fragmentation of Alexander's vast but, frankly, unstable empire. Rome seized opportunities presented by a changing world.
Okay, that brings us right into section 2. Focusing on the Roman Empire itself, its structure and incredible expansion, the sources detail its evolution from a republic to an empire.
Right. For several centuries, Rome operated as a republic. The sources describe this phase as having a complex system of government. It wasn't a simple democracy. It involved elected magistrates, assemblies, and the very powerful Senate.
And religion and society played a big part too.
Oh yeah, the sources make it clear that religion and social structures, particularly the influence of powerful families, played significant roles alongside the formal political institutions. It was all intertwined.
And who was really running things during the Republic? The sources point to rule by a small group of wealthy nobles, which they term the nobility.
Yes, the sources described a republic as a system where a relatively small number of wealthy aristocratic families held immense power, dominating elected offices and the Senate. This created a society with clear social divisions, but the political system, though complex, did allow for a degree of public participation among citizens at least.
Yeah.
Well, in theory.
In theory.
Right.
The reality was often different.
The shift to an empire, or rather the imperial system, really solidifies in the late 1st century BCE. The sources mention Julius Caesar's role, but emphasize the formal establishment of the principal by Augustus, originally known as Octavian, in 27 BCE.
This transition is fascinating, and the sources give us insight into it. The principle is a key concept. Augustus became, in effect, the sole ruler, but he was very careful not to call himself king or openly dismantle the republic.
Why not?
Well, the sources explain he maintained the appearance of respecting the old republican institutions, like the Senate. He presented himself as the leading citizen, or princeps civitatis, hence principal, the first among equals, when in reality he consolidated ultimate authority in his hands. It was a politically brilliant move to gain absolute power without triggering the fierce anti-monarchist sentiments that were deeply ingrained in Roman culture after the overthrow of their kings centuries earlier. He basically kept the old facade, but changed the power structure behind it. It was a careful dance between new reality and old tradition, and language within this vast state. The sources note Latin as the primary language, particularly in the West, and for administration.
Latin was the language of the army, the law courts, and the central administration, which obviously gave it huge importance, particularly in the western provinces that hadn't really been part of the Hellenistic world before.
But Greek was still important.
Critically important, yes. The sources stressed that Greek remained vital, especially in the eastern half of the empire. This wasn't just because people preferred it. It was the lingua franca of the eastern Mediterranean, inherited from Alexander's time.
So a long history there.
Exactly. Administration, intellectual life, and trade in places like Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor continued significantly in Greek. The empire was inherently bilingual at the elite and administrative levels, and much more multilingual on the ground, with Syriac, Coptic, Punic, Berber, Celtic, Aramaic, and many other languages spoken by millions across the provinces. It was a real patchwork.
And this state grew to an absolutely staggering size, truly an empire across 3 continents, as the sources highlight.
That title is spot on. The sources emphasize the sheer geographical scale at its peak. Imagine a single political entity that completely surrounded the Mediterranean Sea, the Mar Nostrum, our sea, as the Romans proudly called it.
It stretched from the rainy islands of Britain in the northwest across Western and Southern Europe
Yeah, all the way through North Africa, down into the fringes of the Sahara.
and across the Middle East, bounded by rivers like the Rhine and the Danube in Europe and reaching the Euphrates in the east, bordering that Sasanian rival we mentioned.
It was enormous, encompassing deserts, mountains, fertile river valleys, and vast coastlines. And within these sprawling boundaries, the sources repeatedly stress, lived an almost unimaginable diversity of peoples.
So many different groups.
We're talking about dozens, perhaps hundreds, of distinct ethnic, linguistic, and cultural groups brought under one rule. Managing that level of diversity was an ongoing challenge and really a defining characteristic of the empire.
So, how did they govern such a colossal and varied territory? The sources suggest governing actually became easier under the empire compared to the republic. That seems counterintuitive given the size.
It does seem that way, but the sources argue that the centralized authority of the emperor, combined with the professional standing army, provided a level of control and administrative efficiency that the republic's more fragmented system, with its competing factions, lacked. The emperor's power could, in theory, streamline decision-making and enforcement across vast distances.
And the system involved provinces, right? How did that work on the ground?
Yes, the empire was divided into numerous provinces, each typically overseen by a governor appointed by the emperor. These governors, often former consuls or praetors, top political figures, held immense power, military, judicial, and administrative, within their territory.
A lot of authority in one person's
It's a
hands.
huge amount. They were supported by military commanders stationed in the province and a network of Roman officials, tax collectors, and legal experts.
Now, the sources mention collaboration with local upper class as being key. How did that actually function?
This is a really important insight from the sources. Rome didn't simply replace local structures everywhere with Roman officials. That would have been impossible, really.
Too many people, too much land.
Exactly. Instead, they actively co-opted and relied on the existing local elites, wealthy landowners, city councilors, traditional leaders. These individuals were often granted Roman citizenship, incorporated into the Roman social hierarchy, sometimes even reaching the senatorial or equestrian ranks, and given responsibilities like collecting taxes, maintaining order, and funding public works in their cities.
So they leveraged the existing power structures.
Precisely. It was a pragmatic approach. Rome provided the overall framework, the military security, the legal system, while local elites handled the day-to-day management, leveraging their existing influence and knowledge of the local population. It was a form of indirect rule that made the vast empire governable without an impossibly large Roman bureaucracy. The sources suggest this collaboration model was fundamental to Roman control and integration.
So it was less direct occupation and more building a collaborative pyramid of power with Roman authority right at the top.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. That's the picture the sources paint. It allowed for flexibility and relied on shared interests. The local elites benefited from Roman order and the opportunities that came with it, while Rome benefited from their administrative capacity and hopefully their loyalty.
And none of this would have been remotely possible without the Roman military machine. The army was legendary. What do the sources emphasize about its nature and role?
The sources are absolutely clear. The Roman army was the backbone of the empire. They describe it as a professional, standing, salaried force. This was a significant departure from earlier citizen militias or temporary levies you saw in many other states.
A real career path.
Absolutely. Soldiers enlisted for long terms, typically 25 years, and received regular pay, training, and benefits upon retirement, like land grants or a cash bonus. This professionalism was crucial for both conquering territory and then keeping it under control across those vast distances.
Yeah, it wasn't just about winning battles, was it?
Not at all. It was about building and maintaining frontiers, constructing infrastructure like roads and forts, policing the provinces, and just generally projecting Roman power. The sources give a sense of its sheer scale, noting a force of around 600,000 soldiers in the 4th century CE.
600,000. That's an enormous standing army for the ancient world.
It really is. And supporting 500,000+ people requires incredible logistics. The sources mention supply lines and manufacturing.
Right, you can't just have soldiers. You need to feed them, arm them.
Exactly. This highlights the sophisticated organization behind the army. They weren't just fighters, they were builders and engineers too, maintaining that many soldiers meant ensuring constant supplies of food, weapons, armor, clothing, and building materials, often produced and transported over vast distances. The army essentially had its own integrated logistics and manufacturing support system. It was a huge economic and organizational undertaking in itself.
Their success wasn't just size, though. The sources mention discipline, organization, and motivation.
These were key Roman military values, definitely. Rigorous training, standardized organization into legions and cohorts, and strict discipline were legendary and often gave them an edge. Motivation came from the pay, the prospect of retirement benefits, opportunities for promotion, and the shared identity and pride, the esprit de corps of being part of the Roman army.
But it wasn't always smooth sailing, was it? The sources mention mutinies.
They do, and that's a crucial nuance. It reminds us that while the army was loyal to the emperor, or the idea of the emperor, that loyalty wasn't always absolute or directed toward the specific individual on the throne, especially during periods of political instability.
So they could be a disruptive force, too.
Very much so. Soldiers could be unhappy with pay, conditions, or who was leading them. Their sheer numbers and concentration of power meant they could exert immense political pressure, sometimes even deposing emperors and proclaiming their own candidates. The army wasn't just an instrument of the state, it was a powerful political actor in its own right.
A double-edged sword, then.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And the sources also note that Roman military tactics, organization, and engineering achievements were often adopted by successor states after the empire's decline in the West.
So their influence lived on even after the political structure changed.
Yes, indicating the lasting impact of Roman military innovation. Things like road building, fort design, siege warfare techniques, and even basic unit organization influenced military practices in the new kingdoms that emerged from the former empire. Their military legacy persisted long after Roman political unity fractured.
So we've seen the vast structure of the empire and the military muscle that built and maintained it. Let's shift gears and delve into the heart of Roman society and its economy. Section 3. What was the engine driving this colossal state? What paid for all those soldiers and governors?
Well, the sources make it very clear. The Roman economy was fundamentally agrarian. Agriculture was the absolute base, providing the vast majority of wealth and sustenance. Everything else really rested on that foundation.
Okay, so farming, first and foremost. What kind of products were key?
Grain was paramount, absolutely essential for feeding the population, especially the large cities like Rome itself. Olive oil and wine were also incredibly important staples and major products.
Staple goods, yeah.
And the sources note these were major exports, particularly from the western regions like Italy, Spain, and North Africa. Areas like Egypt were vital breadbaskets, supplying Rome itself with enormous quantities of grain.
And connecting all of this was an extensive network of trade, I assume.
Yes. The sources describe vast trade networks, really facilitated by those famous Roman roads, and the relative safety of the Mediterranean, the Mare Nostrum, we mentioned earlier. Pax Romana, Roman peace, made large-scale trade much easier.
So goods moved easily?
Relatively easily, yes. These networks connected every corner of the empire. Agricultural products moved from surplus regions to deficit ones. But the sources also highlight the flow of goods into the empire, particularly luxury items, spices, silks, precious stones, exotic animals often coming from the east.
From beyond the borders.
Right, demonstrating those ongoing connections with places like India and maybe even China, often mediated by rivals like the Sasanians who controlled parts of those routes.
Beyond farming and trade, the sources mention other significant economic activities. Mining, for instance, sounds like it was a big deal.
Mining was a massive and often state-controlled or leased enterprise. The sources specifically mention hydraulic mining in Spain. This wasn't just a few guys with pickaxes. It was an industrial-scale operation.
Hydraulic mining, what did that involve?
They would divert rivers or build huge reservoirs, then release torrents of water to literally wash away huge amounts of earth and mountainsides, exposing mineral veins like gold and silver.
Wow.
It was incredibly labor-intensive, often using forced labor, and environmentally destructive even then, but hugely effective at extracting precious metals. The sources provide figures suggesting, maybe over 125,000 kilograms of gold produced per year from Spanish mines alone at certain points.
That's an astounding amount of wealth from just one region and one activity.
It gives you a sense of the immense wealth this generated for the Roman state and the elite who often control these operations.
And banking and organized commerce were also part of this picture?
Yes. The sources indicate a degree of sophistication in Roman finance and commerce. There were bankers, systems for credit, loans, maritime insurance, and organized trade associations or guilds, collegia. The widespread use of money was absolutely key.
Coinage.
Yes, the denarius, initially primarily silver, and later the gold solidus became standard currencies across the empire. The state tried hard to maintain the stability of its coinage, though this proved challenging during crises. When they started debasing the currency, reducing the silver content, it led to inflation.
Right.
But the value of the denarius, equivalent to about 412 grams of pure silver, initially provides a tangible metric for the scale of their monetary economy and the value placed on stable currency for trade and taxation.
Now, we absolutely have to discuss a deeply ingrained, pervasive, and utterly central element of the Roman economy that the sources highlight: slavery.
Yes, the sources are unequivocal about this. Slavery wasn't a peripheral aspect of Roman society. It was absolutely fundamental and integral to the economy, especially in Italy and the wealthy provinces of the Near East. It provided a huge proportion of the labor force.
Where was this labor used?
Pretty much everywhere. Agriculture, particularly on the large estates, mining, construction projects, manufacturing, domestic service in wealthy households. Enslaved people were doing a vast amount of the physical work.
The figure the sources give for Italy alone is almost unbelievable. Approximately 7.5 million slaves in the mid-1st century CE.
It's staggering.
When you consider the total population estimates for Italy at the time, that number is just. It could be a third or even more of the population.
It is a truly immense number and illustrates just how reliant the Roman system was on enslaved labor. The sources note the treatment of slaves varied enormously, of course.
Oh, so.
Some, particularly skilled urban slaves, tutors, accountants, cooks, or those in close contact with perhaps more benevolent masters, might experience relatively decent conditions, maybe even gain freedom eventually. But many others, especially those forced to work in the brutal conditions of mines, quarries, or large agricultural estates, latifundia, faced horrific exploitation, cruelty, and often very short lifespans.
The sources even delve into Roman perspectives on managing slaves, mentioning writers like Columella and Pliny the Elder discussing different techniques.
Yeah, like using chain gangs versus smaller, more supervised teams for farm work.
It sounds so calculated.
That shows the calculated nature of Roman slavery. It wasn't just random brutality, though there was plenty of that. It was a system designed to maximize labor extraction and control. These writers offered practical advice, reflecting a focus on efficiency and preventing resistance.
And the sources highlight some truly grim details from the legal system, too.
They do. One example mentioned, attributed to the historian Tacitus, details a law where if a master was murdered by a slave, all the slaves in that household, regardless of guilt or even knowledge of the crime, could be legally put to death.
That is chilling. Collective punishment of the most extreme kind.
It shows the absolute power masters held and the precariousness of life for the enslaved.
And they mention other examples, like debt bondage, where desperate parents in places like Egypt would sell their children into slavery.
Yes, the sources provide these specific harrowing examples to illustrate the extreme vulnerability of many people in the Roman world. Poverty, debt, capture and war. These could strip you of your freedom. The legal system often reinforced the power of masters over slaves in brutal ways, making resistance incredibly difficult and risky. It reveals a stark and often brutal aspect of Roman society, deeply embedded in its economic structure.
Moving from the economy to the social structure, the sources outline a pretty clear hierarchy.
They do, often referencing Roman writers like Tacitus, who describe the basic social layers. At the very top were the senators, known as the patres, fathers.
The elite of the elite.
Absolutely. Below them were the equidates, or knights, and then the vast majority of the population fell into the lower classes, often referred to with terms like plebe surdita, which translates roughly as dirty commoners, or humilior, lower status individuals, indicating their relative lack of status and privilege compared to the upper orders, honestiores.
Tell us more about the senators. What defined them?
The sources describe the senatorial class as the pinnacle of Roman aristocracy. They were the wealthiest landowners. Their status and power derived primarily from vast agricultural estates, worked largely by enslaved or dependent labor. They dominated political life for centuries, holding the most important offices in the Republic and maintaining significant influence, albeit sometimes reduced, even under the emperors. Access to this class was tightly controlled and based on wealth thresholds, birth, and imperial favor.
And the equites, the knights, where did they fit in?
The equites were the class just below the senators. They were also typically wealthy, often landowners themselves, but many were involved in commerce, tax farming, public contracting, banking, and financial activities.
So more involved in business.
Often, yes. The sources suggest they often aligned with senatorial interests, but also provided a pool of talent for important administrative roles and military commands. They were kind of the business and administrative backbone just below the senatorial elite. They could be very influential.
And the lower classes, the plebs, sordida, and humilior, that sounds like a very broad group.
It was incredibly diverse, encompassing the vast majority of the free population. This group included free citizens who were small farmers, rural laborers, tenant farmers struggling to get by, migrant workers following harvests, skilled artisans in cities like potters, blacksmiths, weavers, shopkeepers, casual laborers working in ports or construction, fishermen, entertainers, and then, of course, outside this structure but interacting with it were the millions of slaves we discussed. Their lives and economic roles varied hugely, but they shared a common characteristic: limited wealth, little direct political power, and vulnerability to economic hardship and the authority of the elites.
The sources really underscore the immense wealth concentrated at the very top. That example of the Roman aristocracy in Thebes, Egypt, receiving thousands of gold denarii per year just from their properties is astonishing.
It is. It vividly illustrates the scale of wealth inequality. These elite families often owned properties spread across multiple provinces, generating truly enormous incomes, primarily from land rent and the labor of others. Thousands of gold denarii per year would be an absolute fortune, highlighting the vast economic gulf between the senatorial elite and the majority of the population who produced that wealth.
Shifting focus a bit to daily life, the sources offer glimpses into the contrast between bustling urban centers and the more dispersed rural countryside.
Yeah, cities were really the engines of Roman administration, culture, and much of its economy. Major centers like Rome itself, Carthage in North Africa, Antioch in Syria, and Alexandria in Egypt were huge metropolises for the ancient world.
What were they like?
The sources describe them as packed with people, noise, and activity. They boasted impressive public infrastructure. Aqueducts, bringing fresh water over long distances for drinking, bathing, and sanitation. Grand public baths that served as crucial social centers. Theaters for plays, and massive amphitheaters for gladiatorial combats and other spectacles.
Like that example you mentioned from the sources, the amphitheater in Vindonissa, I think it was a military camp in Switzerland, hosting games for 176 days a year. That's almost half the year dedicated to public entertainment.
It really highlights the importance of public entertainment and leisure bread and circuses in Roman urban life. It was often provided by the state or wealthy elites to entertain and, let's be honest, pacify the urban population.
But cities also faced immense challenges, didn't they? Particularly feeding everyone.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Feeding those vast urban populations was a constant logistical nightmare. The sources reference accounts like the physician Galen's description of famine in the countryside affecting city supplies, showing how precarious food supply could be, especially during bad harvests or disruptions to transport. It required massive logistical efforts for importing grain, especially to Rome, and large-scale methods for storing grain and other staples after harvest in granaries. Huria.
And rural life was inherently different, centered on the agricultural cycle.
Yes, life in the countryside was generally simpler, quieter, with less infrastructure and fewer amenities than the cities. It was dominated by farming, planting, tending, harvesting, or in some regions like mountainous areas, by pastoral practices like transhumance.
Transhumance.
That's the seasonal movement of livestock, like sheep or goats, between high summer pastures in the mountains and lower winter grazing lands in the valleys. It was a common practice in many parts of the empire. So, while the cities were hubs of power, administration, jurisdiction, and economic exchange, the rural areas were where the vast majority of the population lived and where the essential wealth of the empire was generated through agriculture and resource extraction.
The empire also encompassed an astonishing level of cultural diversity, didn't it? We touched on languages earlier.
Absolutely. The sources stress that across those three continents, Rome couldn't really impose a single monolithic culture. Instead, it was a complex mosaic of existing traditions, languages, dress, customs, and religious practices.
So people kept their local ways.
To a large extent, yes. People continue to speak Latin and Greek, of course, but also Coptic in Egypt, Syriac and Aramaic in the Near East, Punic and Berber languages in North Africa, various Celtic languages in the West and Britain, and many other local tongues. Romanization happened, certainly, especially among elites and in cities, but local cultures remained vibrant.
That sounds like a linguist's dream, or maybe a nightmare for administrators trying to communicate.
Probably a bit of both. It meant administration and communication required multilingual individuals or relied heavily on translators and intermediaries.
And literacy. Was it common?
The sources touch on literacy levels. While certainly not universal like today, it was probably more widespread than perhaps once thought. varying greatly by region, technical skill needed for a job, and social class. It wasn't just the elite who could read and write.
What's the evidence for that?
The sources point to evidence like the huge number of papyrus documents found in places like Egypt, contracts, letters, accounts, and famously the graffiti preserved in Pompeii.
Ah, the Pompeii graffiti. That's such a vivid detail. People just scribbling on walls.
Exactly. It shows people writing mundane things, political slogans, personal messages, love notes, even simple advertisements, or just names. It really does give us a glimpse into a degree of casual literacy among non-elites, in an urban setting at least. It suggests that reading and writing were skills possessed by a wider segment of the population than just the highly educated upper classes.
Interesting.
The sources also briefly touch on aspects of daily life like gender roles and family structure. They note the prevalence of the nuclear family structure, parents and children, as the basic unit.
And women's rights.
They point out that women's legal rights, particularly regarding property ownership and inheritance, and even divorce, evolved over time, generally offering women of the upper classes at least greater autonomy, legally speaking, than in some earlier Greek or Near Eastern societies. They could own property, manage businesses, and initiate divorce in certain circumstances. They also mention interesting details like typical marriage ages, often differing significantly between men and women, with women usually marrying much younger.
So a vast, complex, diverse, and incredibly wealthy society, built and maintained by the military, but also underpinned by massive inequality and dependence on enslaved labor. But as history inevitably shows us, no empire remains static, and eventually this system faced immense challenges. Section 4 covers this period of transformation and the rise of new powers. The sources talk about the 3rd century crisis.
Yes, this period, roughly starting in the 230 CE, is described by historians, based on the sources, as a pivotal turning point. It was a time when the strains on the empire became severe and systemic. It wasn't just one problem. It was a whole cascade of issues hitting at once.
A perfect storm, almost.
You could call it that. It was a period of significant internal turmoil, compounded by intense external pressures on the frontiers.
What kind of external pressures were hitting the frontiers? Where were the threats coming from?
The sources detail frequent and increasingly severe invasions across the empire's borders. In Europe, Germanic tribes groups like the Alemanni, Franks, and especially the Goths were pushing hard against the Rhine and Danube frontiers, launching raids and sometimes major incursions deep into Roman territory, sacking cities and disrupting life.
And that old rival in the east, Sasanian Iran, becomes a major threat again. We mentioned them earlier.
Absolutely. The sources highlight renewed and aggressive campaigns from the Sasanian Empire under dynamic rulers like Shapur I, who saw themselves as successors to the ancient Persian emperors and wanted to reclaim territories. They launched significant attacks against Rome's eastern provinces.
Serious campaigns.
Oh, yes. They even managed to capture Antioch, one of the empire's largest and most important cities, on multiple occasions, and famously captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in battle around 260 CE. This wasn't just border skirmishes, it was a major existential conflict on the Eastern Front, happening at the same time as the pressure in the West.
And internally, things were falling apart too. The sources provide that astonishing statistic: 25 emperors in just 47 years between 235 and 282 CE.
That level of turnover at the very top is a clear indicator of a system breaking down. It was a period of near constant civil war and military coup.
How did that happen?
Well, generals, often proclaimed emperor by their own loyal troops, would march on Rome or fight rival claimants, creating chaos and diverting resources, and soldiers desperately needed to defend the frontiers from those external threats. The forces make it clear that this constant internal conflict severely weakened the central authority, disrupted administration and tax collection, damaged the economy through war and instability, and made it incredibly difficult for Rome to respond effectively to the external threats. The empire was being squeezed from outside and fracturing from within.
Meanwhile, something else profound was growing and spreading across the empire during these turbulent centuries: Christianity.
That's right. The sources note the origins of Christianity in Palestine, a Roman province, in the early 1st century CE within the empire itself. And they trace its complex, often difficult, but ultimately successful, spread across various regions of the empire over several centuries.
It wasn't an overnight success then.
Definitely not. The sources emphasize it wasn't a uniform process. Christianization was gradual and unfolded differently in various areas. It spread through urban centers first, along trade routes, and often faced periods of local or sometimes wider persecution.
And it was fundamentally different from the polytheistic religions that were common in the Roman world, right?
Yes, a key difference the sources highlight is the monotheistic nature of Christianity and Judaism, which also existed within the empire, compared with the widespread polytheism of the Greco-Roman world. Romans typically worshipped a variety of gods, goddesses, and local deities, and were often quite happy incorporating new ones into their pantheon.
But Christians wouldn't do that.
No. This exclusive monotheism, particularly the Christian refusal to participate in the imperial cult, making sacrifices for the well-being of the emperor, which was seen as a civic duty, sometimes brought them into conflict with Roman authorities. This led to periods of persecution, though the sources suggest this was often sporadic and localized rather than constant and empire-wide, at least for the first couple of centuries.
And the church itself was developing.
Yes. The sources also discuss how the church, as an institution, gradually developed its organizational structures, with bishops overseeing communities, defined its core doctrines through councils, established its own scriptures, and how key figures like bishops and, later, monks gained increasing influence in society and politics during the period known as Late Antiquity, especially after Emperor Constantine's conversion in the early 4th century.
This whole period of crisis and transformation eventually led to a significant change in the structure of the empire itself, didn't it?
It did, partly as a response to the sheer difficulty of managing such a vast territory and fighting wars on multiple fronts simultaneously. The empire was formally divided into eastern and western halves for administrative purposes. This started happening under Emperor Diocletian around the end of the 3rd century with the Tetrarchy, and the division became more permanent later on, with separate emperors and administrations, though theoretically still one empire.
But the western half ultimately faced overwhelming challenges that the East managed to weather better.
That's right. The sources describe increasing migrations and invasions by various groups. The Goths, Vandals, Lombards, Franks, Anglo-Saxons, among others, pressing into and eventually settling within the Western Roman Empire's territories during the 4th and 5th centuries.
Was it just invasions?
It was a complex mix of migration, invasion, negotiation, and settlement. But over the course of the 5th century CE, this pressure, combined with ongoing internal weaknesses, economic strain, political instability, difficulty recruiting and paying the army, led to the gradual collapse of central Roman authority in the West. The traditional date for the fall is often given as 476 CE, when the last Western Roman emperor was deposed.
And new kingdoms were formed within the old Western territories by these groups.
Exactly. The sources detail the emergence of new political entities, kingdoms ruled by groups like the Visigoths in Spain and southwestern Gaul, the Vandals in North Africa, the Lombards later in Italy, the Franks in Gaul, which became modern France, the Anglo-Saxons in Britain.
So the end of the empire in the West wasn't just nothingness.
No, not at all. It was a political transformation where the Western Roman Empire fragmented into a series of successor kingdoms. And importantly, these kingdoms often retained aspects of Roman administration, law, taxation systems, and culture, albeit in modified forms and often blending with their own traditions. It was an end, but also a beginning.
But the Eastern Roman Empire had a very different fate, as you said.
Fundamentally different. The sources emphasize that the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital at the strategically brilliant location of Constantinople, modern Istanbul, remained largely united, maintained a strong central government, a functioning bureaucracy, a powerful army, and a vibrant economy. It continued to exist for another 1,000 years after the fall of the West.
We often call it the Byzantine Empire, right?
Exactly, though they always call themselves Romans. The East experienced periods of considerable prosperity and cultural achievement, maintaining sophisticated administration and vibrant urban life. It wasn't without its own challenges, of course. Well, it faced devastating wars, particularly with the Sasanian Empire in the 6th and early 7th centuries, and later with Arab caliphates and others. And the sources mentioned the massive demographic impact of events like the Justinianic plague in the mid-6th century, which seems to have killed a huge percentage of the population and had profound long-term effects. But fundamentally, it survived and adapted.
And during this prolonged period of transformation in the West and continuity in the East, another immense historical force emerged, also dramatically reshaping the geopolitical landscape: Islam.
Yes. The sources introduced the rise of Islam in Arabia in the 7th century CE, founded by the Prophet Muhammad. And they highlight the absolutely rapid and sweeping expansion of the Arab conquests in the decades immediately following Muhammad's death in 632 CE.
They conquered vast territories remarkably quickly, didn't they?
Astoundingly so. The sources state that unified Arab armies, fueled by religious fervor, tribal unity under the new faith, and effective military leadership, conquered huge swaths of former Roman territory in the East Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and eventually all of North Africa remarkably efficiently.
Why were they so successful so quickly?
Well, they often took advantage of the fact that the Eastern Roman and Sasanian empires were exhausted from decades of brutal warfare against each other just before the Arab conquest began. They were weakened militarily and financially. The Arabs also conquered the entire Sasanian Empire in Iran, ending that long-standing rival of Rome.
And the sources mention economic motives too, the search for control of trade
But
networks.
while religious and political factors were certainly paramount, controlling the incredibly lucrative trade routes, the same ones the Romans and Sasanians had long vied for, connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean and Central Asia, was certainly a significant economic motivation and a major consequence of the Arab expansion.
So they took over these key routes.
They did. Their conquests incorporated these vital arteries of East-West trade into the new, vast Arab caliphate that stretched, at their height, from Spain across North Africa and the Middle East deep into Central Asia.
So the sources paint a picture of this era from roughly 100 BCE to 1300 CE as one of enormous change. The Western Roman Empire collapses politically and gives way to new kingdoms. The Eastern Roman Empire endures and transforms into Byzantium, and immense new empires like the Arab Caliphates rise, incorporating significant parts of the old Roman and Sasanian worlds. A total reshaping of power, religion, and culture across these three continents.
It's a period of profound discontinuity, especially in the West, but also striking continuity and adaptive transformation in the East, and the dramatic emergence of entirely new power centers and civilizations that built upon, absorbed, and transformed elements of the empires they replaced. It really sets the stage for the medieval world.
Which brings us to Section 5, connecting the threads and pulling out the key lessons and insights from this deep dive based on your sources. What are the big takeaways?
Well, we've covered a lot. We've seen the immense scale and geographical reach of the Roman Empire, how it attempted to govern such vast and diverse territory through a combination of military power, administration, and collaboration with local elites.
Right, that collaboration point was key.
Definitely. We looked at the complex relationship between its economy and society, including the central foundational role of slavery, the rigid social layers, the contrast between urban and rural life, the constant challenges it faced, from both external threats on multiple frontiers and internal instability, like that devastating third-century crisis, and then the dramatic transformations of the period, the rise and eventual triumph of Christianity, the political fragmentation of the West, the resilience of the East, and the emergence of new empires like the Arab caliphates, reshaping the map entirely.
Drawing on these sources, what does this deep dive tell us about the fundamental nature of large empires, maybe empires in general?
I think the sources provide a fantastic case study revealing both the strengths and the inherent weaknesses or challenges of managing political entities on this kind of scale. The strengths are clear. A remarkable capacity for organization, building infrastructure that lasted centuries. You can still walk on Roman roads today.
Ew.
Fostering extensive and relatively secure trade networks across huge areas which spurred economic activity. And maintaining powerful, disciplined military forces capable of both conquest and long-term defense, at least for a time.
But the weaknesses seem deeply tied to the very things that made them strong. Scale and diversity seem like constant challenges.
Precisely. The sources really show the immense difficulties of effectively managing incredibly diverse populations with different languages, customs, religions, and loyalties across vast distances. Communication was slow, control was never absolute.
And succession. Getting a new emperor seemed messy.
Succession issues for supreme power were a constant source of instability, especially since there wasn't always a clear, accepted mechanism like primogeniture. This often led to civil wars. And maintaining those long frontiers against various external groups required immense resources, manpower, money, and was always vulnerable to coordinated pressure or moments of internal weakness, as we saw clearly in the third-century crisis and the eventual collapse in the West. Managing both internal cohesion and external security simultaneously was the constant, difficult balancing act.
And the sources briefly connect back to the idea of nomadic empires, mentioned in the source title, highlighting the relationship between settled empires like Rome and the pastoral peoples on their borders.
Yes, they point out that these relationships weren't always just about fighting. Settled empires like Rome often formed complex relationships, alliances, treaties with nomadic or semi-nomadic groups on their frontiers. Sometimes they recruited them into the military or used them as buffer states.
But they could also be threats.
Oh, absolutely. These groups could also be powerful rivals or devastating invaders, as the Romans found out repeatedly. The sources then mention the later rise of groups like the Mongols under Genghis Khan, who, much like the earlier empires we discussed, explicitly aimed to control those same lucrative trans-Eurasian trade networks that the Romans, Sasanians, and later the Arab caliphates had dominated or sought to dominate.
So it's a recurring theme.
It illustrates a recurring dynamic throughout history, the interplay between settled agricultural states and mobile pastoral groups vying for control over resources, territory, and those vital trade routes.
We have certainly covered a lot of ground today, spanning centuries and continents, looking at an empire that, at its height, must have seemed almost eternal to the people living in it, but ultimately underwent a profound transformation.
And understanding how an empire like Rome functioned, how it leveraged its strengths, how it faced its immense challenges, and how it ultimately changed over time, drawing specifically on the details and perspectives offered in these sources, provides such a rich and nuanced understanding of this pivotal era in world history.
It really does give you that detailed, insightful look at how an empire across 3 continents operated, how it wrestled with massive internal and external pressures, and how its story is a testament not just to power and inevitable decline, but to complex, enduring transformation that reshaped the world and laid the groundwork for entirely new eras and civilizations that followed.
Absolutely. The echoes of those structures, those challenges, those transformations, they really do resonate far beyond the ancient world, don't they?
They really do.
Yeah.
So here's a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to mull over as you go about your day. Looking back at how the Roman Empire managed its vast territory, its incredibly diverse populations, its complex economy built on both extensive trade and widespread forced labor, and the significant internal and external pressures it faced, leading eventually to fragmentation and transformation, what fundamental challenges of large-scale governance, economic structure, and maintaining social cohesion do you think still seem to persist, perhaps in different forms, even in the complex, interconnected world we live in today?
Indeed. History often provides more questions than easy answers, but it certainly highlights the enduring nature of certain human and societal challenges across time. Something to think about.